Hi guys, in this video I'm going to turn this Panzer Grey 135th Panzer I from Takom into this. So sit tight as we go through the steps that desertize this tiny Panzer. Welcome back to LPJ Models. First up, the decal schemes in the base kit didn't give me an appropriate Desert Panzer I scheme, so I decided to use these decals from Star Decals. Some decals, well, one decal needs to be applied before the desert paint scheme is put down. So once this decal was cut away from the sheet, I popped down some VMS decal set and fix to act as an extra adhesive for the decal. I always find adding some extra high quality decal adhesive so important if you're decaling straight over paint like I do. Once the decal had soaked for a few seconds, it was slid off the backing paper into place. And then to protect it from what was to come next, it was sealed in with some VMS Matte Varnish HD. The next step was to lay down some VMS Chipping Medium 3K. This is to allow me to achieve one of those really worn out desert paint schemes you see. In all, I covered the model in around 3 light coats of the VMS chipping fluid. Next up, I had to work out what paints I wanted to use. I'd recently got hold of the AK Real Colours Africa Core set, and I tested out a few combinations on this old 109. I was on the fence between going for a historically accurate colour scheme and one that looked maybe slightly aesthetically nicer, but in the end I settled for the historically accurate RAL 8000 and 7008. That being said, the RAL 8000 was a bit too mustardy for my liking, so I decided to tone it down by mixing in some 7027 grey. This was mixed in at approximately a ratio of 1 part 7027 to 3 parts 8000. And this was enough just to take the edge off of that very strong mustardy RAL 8000 colour. Once the colours were mixed in thoroughly, I thinned this mixture with some Mr. Levelling Thinner. This was thinned at around 60% thinner and 40% paint. To emulate that worn, distressed paint look, I wasn't going to go for a solid coat of coverage. Instead, the paint was built up similarly to how I would do black basing. It was built up with lots of small mottles, leaving some shadows around the rivets, panels and other shadowy areas. There were some areas on the paint scheme where Panzer Grey was still showing through, so I had to be really careful when drawing around these so that there wasn't much overspray. My 0.15 hardened Steenbeck does help with that, but it also helps to spray really close to the model. I'm using around 12 psi to do all of this work. The base colour was carried over all of the rest of the model. You can see some of the shading of the black basing style really showing through, and I think it looks really cool. So with all the base colour complete, it was time to start working on the camouflage. For this I used AK Real Colour 7008. This was thinned again around 60% thinner and 40% paint. And the camouflage markings were sprayed very lightly so as to maintain some of that shading, and also so there wasn't a huge contrast between the camouflage colours. I wanted this to look subtle but noticeable. Again, for tight camo work like this, it's ideal to spray really close to the model at around 12 psi. Too much pressure and you might get spidering with the thin paint, and too little pressure and you might get speckly edges around the edge of your camouflage. And those are two effects that you don't really want. And here's the new desert camo paintwork all finished up. I think it looks pretty slick, but there's still a long way to go before I can even think about calling this one finished. So next up, we're going to reactivate some of that chipping fluid with some warm water and an old brush. This will help to lift up some of that desert paint and show some of the Panzer Grey from underneath, giving me that really nice worn desert paint job. When chipping paintwork like this, it's best not to use tons of water. Just a slightly damp brush is enough to allow the water to activate the chipping fluid. AK real colours are one of the few lacquers that allow you to chip like you were using in acrylic, which is one of the reasons that I specifically chose them for this build. Once all of that chipping was complete, I needed to protect all of that hard work, specifically to stop any decal setting solution from reactivating the chipping fluid. So I gave the entire model a coat of VMS Matte Varnish HD, before moving on and applying the rest of those star decals. The performance of these decals were fairly good, despite being a bit papery, but unfortunately on darker colours you could see the dots where the decals had been printed. To make them fit and conform nicely, I had to trim some of the R markings on the turret sides. I used the open hatches as a rough guide and then cut these carefully into shape. After my cutting adventures, these fit fairly nicely, but like with most decal adventures like this, I will need to touch up some of the edges. The part of the R that sat on the open hatch also conformed really nicely, but they did need a thin layer of VMS decal softener just to help them conform to some of those edges. And again, once all that was done, they were sealed in with a protective layer of VMS matte varnish. Before we can move on to any major weathering, we need to paint some details. All the exposed metallic areas were painted with dark star pewter. Then I moved on to the wood grain on the tools. This was achieved with oil paints. If you want to see this technique in more depth, then I do have a dedicated wood grain tutorial. There's a link to that in the video description. The basic idea is to paint a dark brown oil paint over a tan acrylic colour, and then brush off the excess with a tatty brush, leaving behind streaks that look like wood grain. For painting the tracks, I wanted to try a different approach. First up, they were base coated in a sand colour, and then sponge chipped with some VMS Jipinic CN04. This is a dark grey brown, which is great for old oxidised metal. Next up, I used some of the new VMS pigment jockeys. First up, I speckled over some track rust, just for some variation, before doing the same with some fresh rust pigment jockey. Next up, the tracks were given a wash of VMS coarse sand pigment. This was mixed with a drop of alkyd binders and some universal weathering carrier, just to help keep it in place. Next up, I dry brushed some dark star pewter acrylic paint over the raised areas of the tracks. This is quite a bright paint, so it really does give you that burnished, polished metal look. And for some final variation, I brushed over some VMS pigment jockey, fresh and track rust onto separate track links, just to complete the look. To start the weathering process, I mixed up some sepia and some yellow ochre artist oil paints to get a sort of dirty, mustard kind of dark brown colour. This was pin washed over the entire model to really push the contrast and pick out some of those details. Once that was dry, I added some fading with a mix of yellow ochre and dust oil paints. These were very slightly thinned and mixed together to make a pale natural yellow colour. This pale yellow was then dotted onto flat surfaces before being blended in with a soft brush. This step doesn't change a lot, but it does add a small amount of variation, and these small effects, when combined together, really start to stack up. Before I assembled the running gear, I needed to add some built up sand and grime to the sides of the hull. I used my usual coarse VMS sand pigment, mixed with alkyd binders and universal weathering carrier. This was then brushed on the sides of the hull in a fairly messy manner and then left to dry. To make the application smoother, you can always blend the edges with a soft brush before the pigment's dried. And then to add some realism and another tiny detail, I used Abteilung 502 engine grease to add some grease and oil stains to the running gear. Now that I've finished the sides of the hull, I can put the wheels in place. And repeat the sand and oil process again. Next up, the tracks were carefully fitted into place. Because of the size of these, they're quite delicate, so I did need to be really careful. When I originally built the kit, I had the correct amount of track links on both sides. But strangely, after gluing the drive sprocket into place, I realised that I was one link short. Luckily I had a spare one from the kit, so I just glued this in place with super glue. At present, the Panzer one looks a little bare despite the nice paint job, so it's time to add some stowage. I 3D printed up a selection of items on my Mars 2 Pro. I've provided a link in the video description to all of the files that I've used. Some are free and some are paid, but they're really cheap. Anyway, they were all primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey. I didn't know what I was going to use, so I primed and painted all of them. I was particularly impressed with the fidelity of this kettle, so I knew I was going to add this to the tank. So after painting it normally, to give it a bit more of a worn look, I weathered it very carefully. First up, I added some chips to the enamel finish with some Chippernick CN04, before adding some various tea and coffee stains to the side. This was done with thinned down acrylics. I did add some smoke pigments to the base, but I did forget to film it. There was also a really cool toolbox that I printed, and this was painted up with a wood grain effect. Once I'd painted up all the stowage, it was time to add some tarpaulins. To protect the paintwork, I laid down some cling film on the rear deck of the Panzer 1, before cutting out some regular printer paper and coating this in VMS paper shaper. For smaller tarpaulins or pieces of fabric, I'd usually dip them, but because of the size of this one, I had to spread it in with my fingers and it got quite messy. Once all of the paper shaper had been absorbed, I rolled up the paper into a tarpaulin kind of shape and gave it several creases and folds too. The reason I laid down the cling film on the model was to protect the paintwork from the paper shaper, so I could drape the tarpaulin over the model surface to make sure it bedded down nicely. And once these were dry, it was time to give them a nice coat of paint. As there were two tarpaulins stacked one on top of each other, I painted the lower one in a Feldgrau and the upper one in a desert tan kind of colour. These were then glued in place with some microscale microcrystal clear, which effectively is just a thick PVA glue. I chose this because I could clean up the excess with water and there was a little bit of wiggle time when it came to positioning the stowage. Next up, I put on some of those stowage items that I'd painted earlier. I aimed to add a nice selection of items to make the vehicle look lived in. As a quick note, to achieve the worn iron look on this frying pan, I stippled some Humbrol smoke pigment over some wet Chippernick CN04. One of the last items of stowage to add were the spare tracks on the front of the vehicle. Because these were going to be front and centre, I needed them to look perfect. Oh, and a quick note, these are also 3D printed. After chipping them with the more rusty colour Chippernick CN01, I picked out some individual links with some different acrylic colours. This was followed by brushing and speckling on some pigment jockey, track rust and fresh rust. I picked out different lengths just to add different levels of variation and wear. When this was dry, I burnished some of the metal edges with a 4B artist graphite stick. Once the graphite was down, I burnished it with a cotton bud, just to bring out a little bit of shine. These were then carefully glued in place once again with microscale microcrystal clear. I've always wanted to add in-scale rope to my models. You see rope everywhere, and it wouldn't be unusual to see some coiled around the headlight of a Panzer 1, so I used some ropes in scale 0.5mm rope. Compared to string, this just has a bit more of a realistic edge to it. Once all the stowage was in place, it was time to add some sand to the upper surfaces of the model. I did this step after I'd added the stowage, so the stowage would blend in and look more natural. This sand mix was painted in the crevices on the stowage in anywhere where sand would build up. And whilst it was still wet, some areas were blended in with a soft brush, just to make that transition soft and natural. In the pigment jockey range, VMS do a gunmetal one, which quite intrigued me and I hadn't got around to using it yet, so I decided to use it for the machine guns on this Panzer 1. The PJ was painted over the guns and then left to dry before burnishing it with a soft brush, and the effect looks pretty good. For the ultimate step, I added some rust and soot to the exhaust pipes. And with that final step, the build was complete. Before we get to the final gallery images, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my supporters on Patreon. You guys are awesome and I really appreciate the support that you give to the channel. If you'd like to become a patron, head over to patreon.com/LPJ models. I really enjoyed desertizing this tiny Panzer 1, and I think this is miles ahead of the Panzer 1 I did a few months ago. I like it so much, I might even do a vignette. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Anyway, let me know how you think I did in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe because that really helps me out. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.